are. We're back again. So I don't know where that one kicked off, but we'll really start with this one because there's really nothing other than introductory stuff so far. I have to remember to do that for lab. So we'll do systemic anatomy and we build. So what are we doing first? Basic chapter in lab today, anatomical terminology, generalized structures, directional terminology, regional terms. Then we'll start to look at what they're made out of. We don't do the cell here this term. I mean, most of you who are here most of you had cell in the leg, but we'll explore the cell, and I look at the cell more physiologically in the physiology portion of the program. So I'm not going to sit there and go over nucleus, plasma membrane, but we'll revisit that in the physiology portion of the program in the spring. For those of you that survive dealing with me for a whole year, for a half a year. So we will look at that. So we have connective, so we'll start with tissues, lining tissues, connective tissues. Then we'll start to look at the systems. We start with the exterior, the skin, then we do bone, then we do joints. Then we do muscles, but we're really doing more of the anatomical, not the physiological portion of the muscles. Nerves, the same thing. So we're going to focus more on that. Certain chapters are strictly physiology, certain are more anatomy. But from our perspective, the major ones we're going to look at are bones and joints for both in this term, probably more than anything else. So, and surface anatomy is very important for those of you endeavoring to go into health careers. We look at these things all the time. Okay, that's how you identify where to give an injection. That's how you identify as to structures that may be misaligned. You have to look at their appearance on surface anatomy. Things that you can feel. The word for feel is palpable. Okay, so we palpate certain things to be able to understand where they are. Most of you have learned about it. You all did CPR. Most of you have had some degree of CPR training and or certification, I would endeavor to say. Okay, so you all know where the xiphoid process is. That's surface anatomy. Okay, so you put your finger, at least we used to back in the day when they first started this stuff, fingers here, then 2 finger breadths above it, and put the heel of your hand. Now you're on, off of the xiphoid, you're on the body of the sternum. That way you can get maximum compressions against the heart, against the vertebral bodies, which is how it works. That's the mechanical compression. That's surface anatomy 101. So all of that are part of it. We look at certain muscles, certain veins. You can see see the remnants. I had blood drawn here last week. Okay. So I get every 3 months. And that's probably from the dog. That's all right. He didn't mean it. So all those things are part of it. Microscopic anatomy, yeah, we can't see. When we look at cells, fancily, if you're going on to graduate or medical school levels, professional school levels, cytology is cells, histology is tissues. Those are both very challenging courses. I talk a little bit about developmental. It's mostly in the physiology portion of the program. Okay. So you're looking at embryology, developmental in the context of, and there's examples of it all the time. I mean, there's a great Pittsburgh example of developmental anatomy. Okay, it's Chris Letang. Okay, in the heart, in the intraatrial septa, in that wall, you have a structure that has an opening. When a baby is developing in utero, the mom's breathing, right? So the blood doesn't have to go through the baby's lungs, they're non-functional. So there's a shunt. And there's several structures that create the shunt. One of those, and it's a name that we see in more than one context anatomically, is called the foramen. That means a hole, oval, because it's oval. Okay. When you're born, that little opening closes off and becomes an indentation. So it's called the fossa ovalis. The fossa is like an indentation. So, but his didn't close completely. So there's a little opening, and periodically blood squirts through from the right atria into the left atria. When blood goes through anything like that creates turbulence, red cells slam together, platelets slam together, clots. Well, he's had 2 episodes with clots that have caused stroke or stroke-like problems. Blood's supposed to flow, I do this all the time, get used to it, effortlessly. That's because the lining in blood vessels and in the heart is what's called simple squamous epithelia. It's smooth, so it goes like that. When it hits a bump, it gets off kilter, and then you get turbulence. It's like going whitewater rafting down the Yacht. If you're fans of that, I watch. So we observe, we manipulate, move stuff around, palpate, feel, auscultate, listen with stethoscope. Okay. So there's all sorts of different things. Use all things when you, if you're going into and that's my, if you probably should have guessed by now, my thrust is clinical. That's what I used to do. Okay. So I treated people for, and operated on people for, 25 years. That's my first career. This is my second career. So yeah, 25 years of that, and right now it's almost 25 years of this. So, God. Why am I doing this? So we look at different organ systems: renal, kidney, cardiovascular, heart, blood vessels, blood itself. Physiology is all about cellular and molecular level. So much of the stuff many of you covered in cell and molecular. Okay. So you can go from there. I was going to say something about cell and molecular, but I won't. She's my colleague. I know. That's a tough course. So when I go in and listen to the lectures, I learn a lot. I like to go there and listen. Okay. So we have to understand all those things. And there's a lot to it. The electrical activity, the movement. The electrical activity is so paramount. It really helps you understand the need for how our electrolytes being imbalanced and the problems they can cause are so monumental. It's the only word I can think of. So complementary structure and function is a nice way to say it. How they work together. Great. Yeah, you chew over there. Yeah, who cares? Okay. I love this. It's the organizational table, and they don't have it as complete as they should. But effectively, the interesting subtext of that is we begin to see what are called in most of these, it's a great term, I have horrible emergent properties. It's like school. So most time students come to from high school where they did really well and they go to college, and all of a sudden it's a different level of competition. If you think that's bad, when you go to graduate school or medical school, watch out. When you go from medical school to residency or fellowship, watch out. Every time you go up a level, it becomes much more and more rigorous. You're against people who are achievers and frequently cutthroat achievers. I don't love that, but that's the way life is. So in emergent properties, when we go up a level, we see certain properties develop. So without you teaching basic chemistry or basic biochemicals, okay, atoms are atoms. We know you have protons, electrons, and neutrons. What happens when we start putting them together? Now we go from being subatomic particles that are really unidentifiable. I hate to say it, all protons look alike. All electrons look alike if you can see them. Okay. When you stick them together, now you get an atom. Now you have something that has certain properties associated with it, based on what's over here. You can all see it. We're in a science classroom, right? What's over here? That's right. Table of elements. And you can see it over here. Can't you?
Yeah, I see it.
Hydrogen here. Right? It's a periodic table. So we have all of that. So we have atoms. So now they have some identifiable characteristics. What happens when we put more than one atom together? We get a molecule. So what's a molecule? Okay, molecule has different properties. So we get another emergent property. So we can have a molecule or a compound. What's the difference? Molecule, they're the same. So we took oxygen, a couple of electrons, who knows what it does, but we put two of them together. Now we got something we can breathe. What's the role of oxygen in the cell? Sir? Excellent. We have a winner in New York. It's a terminal electron acceptor. I love that. Because it's got that wonderful O-2, right? What does it want? It wants to gain 2 electrons. Give me your electrons. You're tired, you're full. So, so what happens? You get that bad boy. You can take a half of one of those. Go O with 2 minuses, right? You get H pluses. Accepts those. Okay. So now we have, it can accept all that oxygen itself. We can add 2 electrons because it wants it. We get O-2. Then all those protons from the proton motive force. What do we have? Voila! Something we can get rid of fairly easily. Water. Or either one. It's a good thing. That's an example of an emergent property. Or we can take 2 things. And I always use this example. You can take an explosive metal, sodium. Sodium by itself, they don't even have it anymore. I should ask Dr. Batt. Okay, when we were kids in high school, they had sodium in kerosene in the chemistry lab, and every so often the instructor would get in there with like a chisel, and get a teeny tiny piece and put it in water, and boom! Explosive metal when exposed to air, or actually because it gives up that electron so fast, right? That's what it does. It only got 1 out of 8. On the other hand, you had chlorine, which in its natural form is a poisonous gas. So you take an explosive metal and a poisonous gas, and they would have you believe scientifically that these 2 saw each other, and it's like they were meant to each other. They came together and made table salt. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Sodium in nature is typically already ionized, as is chloride. Yet when we put them together, we have salt. Different. Okay. Different properties whatsoever. Okay. So now we have molecules and compounds. What they missed a step in here, and this is part of your first, for you in biochem, this is part of your first thing. What happens in building blocks? Okay. Amino acids come together and eventually make what? Polypeptides, oligopeptides, dipeptides, tripeptides, oligopeptides, and finally proteins if they're long enough, right? Same thing. Simple carbohydrates come together, complex first we get monosaccharides, disaccharides. Finally, you get complex carbohydrates. Okay? All that good stuff. Right? So molecules don't just go to organelles, they go to macromolecules. In organelle, the diminutive suffix is the ELLE. Most of you would know that. So it's a little organ. It's like pasta. Rigatoni, rigatini. Ricatinis are teeny. Spaghetti, spaghettini. They're teeny. I love that. So, organelles are made out of macromolecules. Generally, you have to have something that forms a boundary. We all know what those are made out of. Phospholipid bilayers with embedded proteins. Semi-permeable membranes. Living membranes. So when you have that and something with functionality, typically genetic material or proteins in the center, think of a mitochondria with a little bit of both, then all of a sudden we have an organelle, a little organ. So now we have more emergent properties. Mitochondria is a great example because now we have energy transfer. So what happens now if we take at least more, probably an organelle or 2, and maybe more, and encase them in yet another enormous membrane to surround it, now we have a living thing. So all the things that you learned about in cell that make a cell. Okay, you have the typical things, DNA, RNA, the usual stuff. You have a nucleus, you have a variety of structures that make our eukaryotic cells. Without going into the distinction, though you should know this already from micro, the distinction between prokaryote, a more simple single-celled life form, cell wall, acellular forms like viruses and prions, viroids, etc. that you learned about in micro. That's all core knowledge, and you need to know this. It's just it's too difficult to reteach it. I'm happy to explain some of it, but I don't want to reteach it, as it were. And the nuances between those are important as well. you know, for though you're having genetics, many of you now, lucky you, okay? And you're going to have, you know, the difference between a single circular chromosome versus pairs of chromosomes, eukaryotic versus prokaryotic. And then the nuances later when we get to like our mitochondria, which is prokaryotic in nature, even though it's been absorbed some evolutionary interesting into former eukaryotes. But nevertheless, that's an organelle with a enriching property. Then we make them into a cell. Now we have a whole slew of different properties. Lining, we could have structural circumstances. We could use them for motion. There's a variety of things. They can be immunological in nature, in the sense that they can move and be scavenger cells like our macrophages are. It's fascinating. So now you have that. Now, if you take, to make a tissue, all you need are similar cells, which we're going to do in lab today. We're going to look at the simplest form of tissue. It's called a lining tissue. It's that one I was doing this with. All of your blood vessels, interior of your heart, covering your heart valves, have simple squamous epithelium. It's a lining that's not designed to be highly functional, but it allows, because it's so thin, a great deal of exchange, and typically it does not have a lot of irregularity, so it's very, very smooth. You're going to find that all over the place. You're going to find that on the external lining on all of your gut. Because why is that? Because it generally secretes a tiny bit of a lubricant that's more water than it is oil, because your bowels are constantly moving over water. How do I know that? Because if you put a stethoscope on your abdomen now, all of us being relatively speaking dressed, you would hear bowel sounds. In the hospital, you listen to that all the time. Patient who's bedbound, you want to hear bowel sounds, because if you don't, then likely things are going to jam up in there and you're going to have some type of significant, particularly post-operative. So now you have tissues. Now, we're still building. If you take more than one tissue, 2 or more, could be 3, could be 6, could be whatever you want, but if you take, I'm just checking the time, if you take 2 or more tissues, now you can make up an organ. You can have a very simple organ, okay, or you can have something that's complex. The liver, extraordinarily important, relatively straightforward. It has an outer boundary, and really a lot of the same type of cells. Yes, it has some conduits coming in and going out for blood coming in, blood going out, blood that's being processed, blood that's being returned to the circulation, bile, and some waste products that are being produced and removed. But effectively, it can be fairly straightforward. And I'll show you the illustration. But effectively now, you've created an organ with 2 or more tissues, but frequently more than 2. That are there, not mandatorily, but frequently. And then when you have the same type of organs, you have an organ system. So if we take the liver and the stomach and the small and large intestine, and we'll get to all those when we look at them anatomically, now you have an organ system. That one's the digestive system. Some of it's shared. Your mouth and pharynx certainly are shared with respiratory. And then we have a great divide, you know, with a very interesting structure called the epiglottis bronchium. So when we swallow, it's what your mom always told you, don't talk when you eat. Chew your food 26 times. Is it ringing a bell? Ruth, I remember. I have lots of great mom and dad stories. My mom and dad were part of the Great Depression. Fascinating in that regard. So how would that would be with your relatives, whether it be grandparents or great? I'd probably be more in your grandparents' age. Okay, and then you have so probably in your great grandparents' age. So they were all depression things. You know, my dad was in college for a semester, and then the money went out. Not even a whole semester. My mom never went to college. Yet, you know, they had a couple of relatively smart kids. My sisters were quite bright. I'm not saying. And then once we combine all those organ systems, we have an organism. And then you can do the ecological niches with populations and communities and that whole number, and that's way above my pay grade. So let's see the examples. Voila! Without getting, here's the mitochondria. So smooth muscle. Smooth muscle makes all those hollow tubes like blood vessels, digestive, varying kinds of smooth muscle, because they're really about endurance. They work slowly, but they work consistently. They don't use up a ton of energy, but they're very reliable, if you want to think of it that way. So a smooth muscle has sort of a spiral shape, somewhat elongated, sort of bigger in the belly area. You'll see that manifested in certain muscles of a larger size of the skeletal variety. They're layered together. They're typically single celled. So here you have that simple lining of epithelial tissue, simple squamous in a blood vessel. You have smooth muscle that create, not always, some of them don't have that layer, but most do. When you get to the capillary level, they don't have that. And then you have some type of exterior sort of to hold it together. So typically you're going to see a lot of these anatomically with 3 layers. A lining layer on the outside, something on the exterior that may be strong, but at the very least a lining. And generally the functionality of it is that muscle in the midst of the level. And then you can see obviously, and there's a lot of distinction between arteries and veins. And then have this. So you get an organism and they're demonstrating it with a footballer, with you. Sorry. One of my colleagues is an ardent Liverpool supporter named Buxton. I'm a Man United supporter. So we argue a lot. And so the typical things. And the same thing is true overwhelmingly, there's a certain amount of this with cells as well. Though not all cells move, but they all have a boundary and a cell membrane, as do we. Movement because we interact with our environment. Responsiveness to alterations and stimuli. I refer to these as energy transformations. So we have to bring stuff in, break it down, that's digestion and metabolism, absorb it, excretion, and obviously we have to have a certain degree of growth for the most part, at least to some mature phase, and reproduction, whether asexually or sexually. Sexually for the species to flourish, asexually, because you'll hear me say this 1,000 times, we don't repair ourselves so much as we replace ourselves. When we have to repair ourselves, we leave scar tissue. That's the problem. If a cut goes deep enough into an area that can't replace itself easily, it forms a scar. So that's the nature of it. There's some things always make damage. I'll go into all of these. So separation of environments, plasma membranes, skin, movement, whether skeletal, internally, blood, food, elimination, contractility. We'll get into that more physiologically. Again, in general, gross reflexes like that are protective in nature. Others, we don't even really have, they're like presets. So it would be like your defaults on whatever electronics you have, with our breathing and things like that. Our lungs expand to a certain part, then they hit a reflex and it says start to contract, or else every time we release it. And we'll get into all of these, what metabolism is. You've heard all this before. Catabolic processes, at least in our bodies, always require water. Everything is in the form of some degree of hydrolysis, where anabolism, putting things together, is generally dehydration, synthesis, or condensation, depending on whatever term you want to use. Waste product removal, extraordinarily important, particularly when we talk about things that we have a lot of trouble with. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is job 1 for the kidney: nitrogenous waste removal. That's the big problem. Things with nitrogen cause us a lot of problems. We have to find ways to get rid of it. And in a society like ours, there's a lot of protein ingestion comparatively. Wealthier areas, settled areas, ingest a lot more proteins as opposed to carbohydrate based. Reproduction, growth, etc., etc. We're multicellular. I'll buy it. Surface cells, okay. And this is sort of, again, this is boilerplate I don't have to go over it extensively. I love this. I'm a big believer in that illustrations are so important. This is great. It's a simple slide. There's a handful of those in every textbook that I just, the word we use in Yiddish is kvel over. Yiddish is Middle German. It's a dialect. It's like around here, a lot of us are sure. It's crazy. Elevator, gotta watch out this time of year. Squirrels. When squirrels get in the fall. Did you ever hear that?
No.
Oh, you know what? I've met a few people who are certified. You're rooming.
Okay, that's fair.
A little unsure. In a good. Look, your alimentary canal is a tube that runs through you. Okay, when you put food in, it's not in. It doesn't get in until it gets processed and absorbed. Okay? So that's a very good illustration. That absorption is carried by your bloodstream, circulated by your heart. What powers that as the blood is constantly being used is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we have the CPR, cardiopulmonary relationship. Yet, you have to filter the blood for waste products, and you have to have a way of disposing a great deal of the waste is much more liquid than solid. Portion. You want to weigh it over it. And certainly here, you have a lot of exchange that occurs. It's a really good slide that sort of gives you a microcosm of what's going on in this thing we call an organism or a body. And this is all neat stuff. Integument is principally skin, hair, and nails. So hair and nails to me are skin appendages. There's subtle differences, particularly in their major structural protein, which is keratin. It does a lot of stuff. External covering, I'll buy that. Vitamin D, major player. Most people, their vitamin D levels are a little low. Vitamin D, and I'll comment on this as time goes on, it doesn't hurt to do a little supplementing, not excessive. A lot of receptors for pain, also control blood pressure. In the area, obviously for heating and cooling. It's involved bone, certainly structural, but that's not all. Blood formation, mineral storage, structural support. There's a lot to it. Joints, effectively, you can't really talk about bones unless you talk about joints, though they're not intrinsically related. Muscular system, obviously, all the things we do, as well as heat generation. But we name muscles based on what they look like. So many people working out, they know if they're looking at latissimus dorsi or pectoralis major. So you get these finger-like projections. They look like a serrated knife. So that's serratus anterior. You know, for you know, the gym people and all that type of stuff. I just basically do the treadmill. Cardio. Sorry. Very simple. Nervous system. What's the central nervous system? Two things: brain, spinal cord. Everything that sticks out of it, peripheral nervous system. We'll get to that at length. Major control system. Rapid responses. This is where it comes from. Slower responses, prolonged. When things happen fast, it goes away fast. When things happen slowly, they go away more slowly. So we're not talking about fractions of a second. We might be talking about seconds, minutes, hours, days. That's all this very limited anatomical, mostly physiological system that deposits chemicals for the most part directly into the bloodstream. That is your endocrine system. Exocrine means it uses a duct, a sweat gland. Comes out of a pore. That's a duct or passageway. Where this directly into the bloodstream, faster response. Cardiovascular, just that. Heart circulating the blood. We'll deal with immune. There's a lot of parts to immune, but lymphatics are really how a lot of particles that are going to be immunologically processed. And the major organs, as well as red bone marrow, that's it. And they're looking at adult red bone marrow. There's a difference. The thymus shrinks as we reach physical maturity, though still functional. And the spleen, which has, again, double duty, because it plays a role in filtering out red cells. And lymph nodes are just that. When your mom said you got swollen glands, Those are swollen lymph nodes. Respiratory, basically nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, lungs, and all the various subdivisions of the bronchial passageways. Digestive, all those. Kidney, really the urine is processed here. Ureter, bladder, and urethra. There's really no processing that goes on. It's just really the way it gets out. Not much to it. And then you have male and female reproductive, and we'll get into that toward the end. And they're not just limited, but they're fairly straightforward. They're male and female reproductive are fairly straightforward anatomically. Female particularly less so physiologically. And they include, by definition, breasts and glandular structures in the breast, much more so in female repro than, let's say, in looking at glands in and of themselves. All the things you would anticipate that you would need, we're just about done. 2 minutes to go. Good timing. Nutrients, oxygen, water, blood temperature, all of these are like that. You need nutrients. Obviously, water we must have. We must have oxygen. We maintain all of these types of things. Without going through that, and I'll come back to it, is this. The whole idea, the single most important word I can tell you about today, maintaining the state of internal balance. That is an imbalance. When something is going wrong inside, we see irregularities in that dynamic equilibrium. Is a wonderful way to express it. There could be too much water, not enough water getting to where it's supposed to be, not enough air, not enough nutrients, however you want to look at it. We measure those fairly simplistically to see if there's an alteration at the very outset. That's what they call vital signs. Respiration, pulse, temperature, blood pressure. Because for the most part, they're looking at a rapid way to look at homeostatic problems. We have a great way of maintaining that degree of homeostasis. We'll talk about it next time when we start talking about negative and positive. Thank you very much. We'll see everybody in an hour in the lab. Once again, until I see you in an hour, have fun storming the castle.